The horse stumbled into Silas Hartwell's ranch with blood on its saddle and terror in its eyes. He had no idea that following its trail into the wilderness would lead him to 2 starving children, alone, shivering, and waiting for parents who might never come back. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Silas Hartwell saw her first through the morning mist, a chestnut mare wandering up the path toward his ranch with an empty saddle and reins dragging through the dust. His blood ran cold before his mind could fully register what he was seeing. That was Jacob Brennan's horse. Jacob, who had ridden out 3 days ago with his wife Martha to check on the family homestead 20 miles north. Jacob, who had promised to return by nightfall the day before. Silas set down his coffee cup on the porch railing and walked toward the mare with measured steps, his worn boots crunching against the frost-bitten grass. The October morning hung heavy with fog that clung to the Wyoming hills like a burial shroud, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out its lonely warning. At 52 years old, Silas had seen enough tragedy on the frontier to recognize its herald when it appeared. An empty saddle never brought good news. The mare was exhausted, her coat slick with dried sweat and her legs trembling from exertion. As Silas caught her reins and ran his calloused hand along her neck, he noticed the dark stains on the saddle leather. His fingers came away rust-colored, and his heart sank like a stone dropped into still water. Blood. Not enough to suggest a mortal wound, but enough to tell a story that made his stomach clench with dread. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from today, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something truly special for you. Silas had known Jacob Brennan for 15 years, ever since the young man had arrived in Copper Creek Valley with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than any hand Silas had ever employed. He had watched Jacob build his small homestead from the ground up, had attended his wedding to Martha, had been there when they announced they were expecting their first child. The Brennans were good people, the kind of neighbors who showed up without being asked when fences needed mending or cattle needed rounding. The kind of people this harsh land needed more of, not fewer. He led the mare to the barn and gave her water and feed, his movements automatic while his mind raced through possibilities. An accident on the trail, perhaps, a fall from horseback, a confrontation with outlaws or hostile travelers. Each scenario played out in his imagination with terrible clarity, and none of them ended well for the young couple who had ridden out on that sunny morning 3 days past. His wife Ellen appeared in the barn doorway, her gray hair pulled back in its practical bun, and her apron dusted with flour from the morning's baking. One look at her husband's face told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a word. 40 years of marriage had given them a language beyond words, a silent communication built on shared sorrows and joys too numerous to count. "That's Jacob's mare," she said, and it was not a question. Silas nodded, his jaw tight. "Saddle's got blood on it. Reins were dragging. She came from the north road." Ellen's hand went to her chest, pressing against her heart as if to hold it steady. "Oh Lord, Martha was expecting. Did you know that? She told me last month, asked me to keep it quiet until she was further along. Said she wanted to surprise Jacob's mother when they visited for Christmas." The news hit Silas like a physical blow. A baby. Not just Jacob and Martha in danger now, but an unborn child as well. The stakes had just risen higher than he could bear to contemplate, yet contemplating them was exactly what he needed to do. Someone had to go looking for them, and there was no one else to do it. "I'm going after them," he said, already moving toward his own saddle hanging on the wall. Whatever happened, they might still be alive, might need help. Ellen did not try to stop him, though he could see the fear in her eyes. Instead, she hurried back to the house and returned minutes later with a saddlebag packed with bandages, food, and a flask of whiskey for medicinal purposes. She also brought his heavy wool coat and the Winchester rifle that had hung above their fireplace since the end of the Indian Wars. "Be careful," she said as he mounted his gray gelding, "and bring them home." He kissed her weathered cheek and turned his horse toward the north road, following the trail of hoofprints that the mare had left in the soft earth. The mist seemed to thicken as he rode, swallowing the familiar landmarks of his valley until he moved through a world of gray shadows and muffled silence. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and the creak of leather as he shifted in the saddle, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of what might have befallen his neighbors. The trail led him through stands of pine and aspen, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Every few hundred yards he would stop and call out, his voice echoing through the empty forest without answer. The silence that followed each call felt heavier than the one before, pressing down on him with the weight of growing certainty that something terrible had occurred. It was nearly noon when he found the first clear sign of trouble. The road curved around a massive boulder, and on the far side he discovered the overturned wagon. Jacob's wagon, the one he had built himself from oak planks cut from trees on his own property. It lay on its side in a shallow ditch, one wheel shattered, supplies scattered across the road like the remnants of a battle lost. Silas dismounted and approached slowly, his rifle held ready. He could see no bodies, which was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. If Jacob and Martha were not here, where had they gone? Had they fled on foot, wounded and desperate? Had they been taken by whoever or whatever had caused this destruction? He knelt beside the wagon and examined the ground with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life reading the stories written in dust and dirt. Multiple hoofprints churned the soil, more than just the Brennans' 2 horses. At least 4 other riders had been here, their horses shod with iron that left distinctive marks. Outlaws, most likely. The kind of desperate men who preyed on travelers in remote areas, taking what they wanted and leaving nothing but grief behind. The blood trail led away from the wagon into the forest, following a narrow path that wound deeper into the hills. Silas felt his chest tighten with grim resolve. Whatever had happened here, whoever was responsible, he would find the truth. He owed that much to Jacob and Martha. He owed it to himself, and to the memory of every good person this harsh land had claimed before its time. He mounted up again and followed the blood into the trees, letting his horse pick its way carefully over roots and rocks. The mist was beginning to lift as the sun climbed higher, shafts of pale light piercing through the canopy and illuminating the forest floor in patches of gold and shadow. In another circumstance, it might have been beautiful. Now it only made the search more urgent, more desperate. The blood trail grew fainter as Silas pressed deeper into the forest, the dark drops becoming smaller and more widely spaced until they disappeared entirely near a creek that cut through the hillside. He dismounted and led his horse across the shallow water, his boots soaking through as he studied the opposite bank for any sign of passage. The soft mud there told its own story, and it was not one he had expected. Small footprints, 2 sets of them, pressed into the earth beside the larger boot prints of an adult. Children's feet, running alongside someone who was either protecting them or pursuing them. Silas felt his confusion deepen, even as a new urgency seized his heart. Jacob and Martha had no children yet. Their baby was still months from being born. So whose small feet had made these tracks? And what were they doing in the middle of this wilderness with blood on the trail behind them? He remounted and followed the prints up the hillside, pushing through thick underbrush that scraped against his legs and caught at his coat. The forest grew darker here, the trees pressing close together as if sharing secrets they had no intention of revealing to outsiders. Somewhere ahead, a branch snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and Silas froze, his hand moving to his rifle with instinctive speed. "Hello," he called out, his voice carrying through the silent woods. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm looking for Jacob and Martha Brennan. They're my neighbors." The silence that followed seemed to breathe with its own presence, alive and watchful. Then, so faint he almost missed it, he heard a sound that made his heart lurch in his chest. A child's whimper, quickly muffled, coming from somewhere just ahead through the trees. He slid down from his horse and tied the reins to a low branch, moving forward on foot with careful steps that made as little noise as possible on the carpet of fallen leaves. The sound had come from a dense thicket of brush surrounding an ancient oak tree, its trunk so wide that 3 men could not have wrapped their arms around it. As he approached, he could see a hollow at the base of the tree, a natural shelter formed by roots that had grown above ground before diving back into the earth. "I can hear you in there," he said gently, keeping his voice low and calm, the way he would speak to a frightened animal. "My name is Silas Hartwell. I have a ranch about 10 miles south of here. I found a horse this morning, a chestnut mare with an empty saddle. I followed her trail here." Another whimper, and then a small voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. "Are you one of them? Are you one of the bad men?" Silas felt something crack inside his chest at the sound of that voice. So young, so terrified, and clearly traumatized by whatever had occurred on this remote stretch of road. He lowered himself to his knees so he would appear less threatening, laying his rifle on the ground beside him in plain view. "I'm not one of them," he said firmly. "I'm a rancher. I raise cattle and horses. I have a wife named Ellen who makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. I don't know what happened to you or who hurt you, but I promise on my honor that I mean you no harm." A long moment of silence followed, broken only by the whisper of wind through the bare branches overhead. Then the brush rustled, and a small figure emerged from the hollow beneath the tree. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with tangled brown hair and a dress that had once been blue, but was now torn and stained with dirt and what looked horribly like dried blood. Her face was streaked with tears, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had witnessed things no child should ever see. Behind her came a second child, a boy several years younger, perhaps 5 or 6 at most. He clung to the girl's hand with desperate strength, his small body pressed against her side as if she were the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly become terrifying and unstable. His fair hair was matted and wild, and he stared at Silas with enormous eyes that held more fear than any child's eyes should ever contain. The sight of them hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. Whatever had happened on that road, whatever violence had overturned Jacob's wagon and left blood on the trail, these children had been in the middle of it. They had seen things that would haunt their dreams for years to come, had somehow escaped into the forest and hidden themselves in this hollow tree, waiting for rescue or death with the terrible patience of the truly desperate. "Please," the girl said, and her voice cracked on the word. "Please help us. The bad men took our mama and papa. They hurt them. They hurt them real bad." Silas rose slowly to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate so as not to startle them further. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, could feel the cold hand of grief beginning to close around his throat. These were not Jacob and Martha's children, but someone's children. Someone who had been on that road when the outlaws struck. Someone who might even now be bleeding and dying somewhere in this vast and indifferent wilderness. "Where are your parents now?" he asked gently. "Do you know where the bad men took them?" The girl shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her dirty cheeks. "They made them get on horses. Mama was crying. Papa was bleeding from his head. They told us to run into the woods or they would hurt us too. So we ran and we ran and we found this tree and we stayed here all night. I tried to keep Elijah warm, but it was so cold." She gestured to the boy who had not spoken a word, his thumb now firmly planted in his mouth as he stared at Silas with those unnervingly large eyes. The girl's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she were sharing a terrible secret. "I think the bad men wanted to hurt us," she said. "I think they would have if Papa had not told us to run. He saved us. He saved us, but now he is gone, and I do not know if we will ever see them again." Silas felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. These children needed him. Whatever else happened, whatever the search for their parents might reveal, his first duty now was to these 2 small survivors who had endured more terror in one night than most people faced in a lifetime. Silas knelt down again, bringing himself to the children's level, and extended his hand slowly toward the girl. She flinched at first, then seemed to study his weathered face with an intensity that spoke of a wisdom forced upon her far too young. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because after a long moment she reached out and placed her small, cold hand in his. "What is your name, sweetheart?" he asked. "Sadie," she whispered. "Sadie Monroe. And this is my brother Elijah. He is 5. He has not talked since the bad men came. I think he is too scared." Silas nodded, understanding more than he could express in words. He had seen men return from war with the same silence in their eyes, the same inability to give voice to horrors that words could not contain. That a child so young should carry such a burden filled him with a rage he struggled to keep hidden behind his calm exterior. "Well, Sadie," he said, keeping his voice steady and warm, "I think you and Elijah have been very brave, but you must be hungry and cold, and this forest is no place for children. Will you let me take you somewhere safe and warm? My wife Ellen will take good care of you while I look for your parents." Sadie's lower lip trembled, and for a moment she looked like exactly what she was, a frightened little girl who wanted nothing more than to be held and told that everything would be all right. But then her jaw tightened with a determination that seemed beyond her years, and she nodded once decisively. "You promise you will look for them," she said. "You promise you will not just leave them out there?" "I promise," Silas replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I will not rest until I find out what happened to your parents and bring whoever did this to justice." He helped the children out of the thicket, noting how Sadie kept herself between him and Elijah at all times, her protective instincts fierce despite her small size. She had become her brother's guardian in the span of one terrible night, and she was not about to let that responsibility slip now, no matter how kind this stranger seemed. The walk back to his horse was slow, the children's legs weak from cold and hunger and the exhaustion that follows sustained terror. Silas lifted Elijah onto the saddle first, the boy as light as a bundle of sticks, and then helped Sadie up behind him. She wrapped her thin arms around her brother's waist and held on with grim determination while Silas took the reins and began leading them back toward the road. As they walked, Sadie began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush as if a dam had broken inside her. They had been traveling from Nebraska, she explained, her family seeking a new start in the Oregon Territory. Her father Thomas was a carpenter, skilled with wood and determined to build a better life for his family in a land of new opportunities. Her mother Catherine had been reluctant to leave her own family behind, but had agreed because she believed in her husband's dreams. They had been 3 days into Wyoming when the outlaws appeared. There were 4 of them, Sadie said, her voice dropping to that terrible whisper again. They came out of the trees so fast. Papa tried to fight them, but they hit him with a gun and he fell down. Mama screamed and screamed. They took everything from our wagon, all our money, all our food, even Mama's jewelry that belonged to her grandmother. Silas listened without interrupting, letting the girl purge the poison of memory through words. He knew from experience that survivors needed to tell their stories, needed to transform raw trauma into narrative that could be examined and eventually perhaps accepted. It was the first step toward healing, though the road ahead would be long and difficult. "They made us watch," Sadie continued, her voice cracking. "They made us watch while they hurt Papa. They laughed like it was funny." Silas felt his hands tighten on the reins until his knuckles went white. The cruelty of it, the casual brutality directed at innocent people seeking nothing more than a fresh start, made his blood boil with righteous fury. He had spent his life building something good on this frontier, and men like these outlaws seemed determined to tear down everything decent that others tried to create. They reached the road and turned south toward home, the gray gelding picking its way carefully along the rutted path. The mist had fully lifted now, replaced by a pale autumn sun that offered light but little warmth. Silas kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation, talking about his ranch, about Ellen, about the horses and cattle that would be curious about these new visitors. He wanted to fill the children's minds with normal, safe things to begin the slow process of rebuilding a sense of security that had been shattered in one violent afternoon. Elijah remained silent, but Silas noticed that the boy's grip on the saddle horn had relaxed slightly, and his enormous eyes seemed less wild with fear. Small victories, perhaps, but victories nonetheless. Every moment these children spent in safety was a moment further from the horror they had endured. They were perhaps 3 miles from the ranch when Sadie suddenly spoke again, her voice sharp with anxiety. "Mr. Hartwell, the wagon. Our wagon is back there. Will the bad men come back for it?" Silas considered the question carefully before answering. He did not want to lie to this child who had already learned that the world could be cruel beyond imagining, but neither did he want to add to her fears. "I will send men to bring your wagon in," he said finally. and I will make sure no one hurts you while you're under my protection. You and Elijah are safe now. I give you my word." Sadie was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller than before, more vulnerable. "Do you think Mama and Papa are still alive?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Silas could not ignore. He thought about the blood on the trail, the overturned wagon, the casual cruelty that Sadie had described. The honest answer was that he did not know, and that the chances were not good. But honesty had its limits when speaking to a child whose entire world had collapsed. "I think," he said slowly, "that we must not give up hope. And I think that your father sounds like a brave man who would do anything to get back to his children. So we will hope, and we will pray, and we will do everything in our power to find them." It was not a promise he could keep, but it was the only comfort he could offer. The Hartwell Ranch appeared through the trees like a sanctuary rising from the wilderness, its sturdy log buildings and neatly fenced pastures a testament to decades of hard work and careful stewardship. Smoke curled from the main house chimney, and Silas could see Ellen standing on the porch, her hands shading her eyes as she watched them approach. Even from a distance, he could see the moment she recognized that there were small figures on his horse, could see the way her posture shifted from anxiety to something more complex as understanding dawned. She was waiting at the gate when they arrived, her face a mask of controlled emotion that Silas knew concealed a whirlwind of questions. Ellen had always been the steady one in their partnership, the calm center around which the storms of frontier life swirled without breaking. But even her legendary composure seemed tested by the sight of two bedraggled children clinging to her husband's saddle. "Silas," she said quietly, "who are these little ones?" He dismounted and reached up to lift Elijah down, the boy's small body rigid with renewed tension at being handled by yet another stranger. "This is Sadie and Elijah Monroe. Their family was attacked on the North Road. I found them hiding in the forest." Ellen's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with horror and compassion in equal measure. She recovered quickly, as she always did, and stepped forward with her arms open and her voice soft with maternal warmth. "Oh, you poor dear children," she said, kneeling down to their level, just as Silas had done. "You must be exhausted and starving. Come inside with me. I have soup on the stove and fresh bread just out of the oven. We will get you warm and fed, and then you can rest." Sadie hesitated, looking up at Silas, as if seeking permission, or perhaps reassurance that this woman could be trusted. He nodded encouragingly, and something in the girl's defensive posture finally relaxed. She took Ellen's offered hand and allowed herself to be led toward the house, Elijah still clinging to her side like a shadow. Silas watched them go, then turned to tend to his horse with hands that trembled slightly from the emotions he had kept suppressed throughout the long ride home. The weight of what he had learned pressed down on him like a physical burden, and he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Someone had to go after those outlaws. Someone had to find out what had happened to Thomas and Catherine Monroe, whether they were alive or dead, captive or abandoned. He unsaddled the gelding and rubbed him down with practiced efficiency, his mind already planning the next steps. He would need to ride to town to alert the sheriff and gather a posse. The outlaws had at least a day's head start, maybe more, and tracking them through the wilderness would require more men than he could muster on his own. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding the Monroes alive. When he entered the house, he found Ellen seated at the kitchen table with the children, a bowl of steaming soup in front of each of them. Sadie was eating with the desperate hunger of someone who had gone too long without food, while Elijah simply stared at his bowl, his small hands wrapped around its warmth but making no move to lift the spoon. Ellen caught Silas's eye and shook her head slightly, a silent communication that said she understood the boy's condition and would handle it with patience and care. She had always been better with children than he was, had mourned quietly for years their inability to have any of their own. Now, watching her tend to these traumatized little ones, Silas felt a bittersweet ache in his chest. He crossed to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee, using the moment to gather his thoughts. When he turned back to the table, Sadie was watching him with those two wise eyes that seemed to see right through any pretense. "You're going to look for them now," she said. It was not a question. "Soon," he replied. "I need to ride to town first to get help. I cannot track 4 armed men by myself." Sadie nodded, accepting this with the same grim practicality she had shown throughout their journey. Then her face crumpled slightly, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a frightened child. "What if you cannot find them? What if they are already gone?" Silas set down his coffee and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her small hands in his large, weathered ones. He could feel her trembling, could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "Listen to me, Sadie," he said firmly. "I have lived on this frontier for more than 30 years. I have tracked outlaws through worse country than this, and I have brought men to justice who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. I am not going to lie to you and say that everything will be fine, because I do not know that for certain. But I am going to promise you this: I will not give up. No matter how long it takes, no matter how far I have to ride, I will find out what happened to your parents. And if there is any way to bring them back to you, I will do it." The tears finally spilled over, running down Sadie's cheeks in silent streams. She did not sob or wail, but simply let the grief flow out of her, while Silas held her hands, and Ellen moved to wrap a comforting arm around her shoulders. Elijah watched his sister cry with those enormous, haunted eyes, and then did something that made Silas's heart clench with unexpected hope. He reached out his small hand and patted Sadie's arm with clumsy tenderness, a gesture of comfort from one traumatized child to another. It was not speech, but it was communication. It was proof that the boy was still in there, still connected to the world despite the horrors he had witnessed. Silas met Ellen's eyes over the children's heads and saw his own hope reflected there. These children would heal. It would take time and patience and more love than they could currently imagine, but they would heal. First, though, he had to find their parents. He had to bring closure, one way or another, to the nightmare that had shattered their young lives. He rose to his feet and reached for his hat. "I'm riding to town now. I should be back before dark with help." "Be careful," Ellen said, the same words she had spoken that morning. But this time, they carried additional weight. The ride to Copper Creek took just over an hour, and Silas pushed his horse harder than he normally would, driven by the image of 2 small children waiting at his kitchen table for news of parents who might already be beyond saving. The town appeared around a bend in the road, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street, modest but growing as more settlers arrived each year seeking their fortunes in the Wyoming Territory. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and pushed through the door without knocking. Sheriff Tom Brennan looked up from his desk, his weathered face creasing with surprise at the urgency in Silas's manner. Tom was no relation to Jacob Brennan, despite sharing the name, but he was a good lawman who had kept the peace in Copper Creek for nearly a decade. "Silas," Tom said, rising from his chair, "what brings you in here looking like the devil himself is on your heels?" Silas told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush as he described the riderless horse, the overturned wagon, the blood trail into the forest, and finally the 2 children he had found hiding in the hollow of that ancient oak. Tom's expression grew darker with each detail, his jaw tightening with the same righteous anger that Silas himself had felt when Sadie told her story. "4 men, you say?" Tom repeated when Silas had finished. "Armed and on horseback with at least a day's head start. That is not going to be an easy trail to follow." "I know it," Silas replied, "but I made those children a promise. I told them I would find their parents. I aim to keep that promise, even if I have to ride all the way to California to do it." Tom nodded slowly, reaching for his hat and gun belt. "You will not be riding alone. I will round up some men, deputize them proper so everything is legal. There are good folks in this town who will not stand for this kind of savagery on our roads." Within the hour, a posse of 8 men had gathered outside the sheriff's office, all of them armed and mounted on fresh horses. Silas recognized most of them, ranchers and shopkeepers who had built their lives in this valley, and understood that an attack on one family was an attack on all of them. The frontier only worked when people looked out for each other, and today that unwritten code was being called upon in the starkest possible way. Among the volunteers was a young man named Daniel Cooper, barely 20 years old but already known as one of the finest trackers in 3 counties. He had learned the skill from his grandfather, a mountain man who had lived among the native tribes for decades before settling down to raise a family. Daniel's eyes had a quality of stillness that reminded Silas of a hawk watching for prey, missing nothing, calculating everything. "I will take point," Daniel said quietly, adjusting the rifle slung across his back. "If there is a trail to follow, I will find it." They rode out of town in a tight formation, the horses' hooves raising clouds of dust that hung in the afternoon air like a portent of things to come. Silas led them back toward the place where he had found the overturned wagon, retracing the route he had traveled that morning with a growing sense of urgency. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western hills, and soon they would lose the light they needed to track. The wagon was exactly as he had left it, lying on its side in the ditch with its contents scattered across the road. But something had changed in his absence. The Monroe's second horse, the one that had presumably fled during the attack, had returned and now stood nearby, grazing on the sparse grass with the unconcerned attitude of an animal that had no understanding of human tragedy. Daniel dismounted and began examining the ground with intense concentration, moving in slow circles outward from the wagon while the other men watched in respectful silence. After several minutes, he straightened up and pointed toward the northwest into the deepest part of the forest. 4 riders, he confirmed. Heading that way, moving fast but not trying to hide their trail. They are confident. Maybe too confident. Or maybe they just do not care, Tom replied grimly. Men who would attack a family with children, leave those little ones alone in the wilderness to die. Those are not men who worry much about consequences. They rode into the forest single file, Daniel leading the way with Silas close behind. The trail was clearer than Silas had expected, the outlaws apparently unconcerned about pursuit. Either they believed no one would come after them, or they were so confident in their own abilities that they welcomed the challenge. Neither possibility was comforting. As the shadows lengthened and the light began to fail, they came upon a clearing where the outlaws had apparently stopped to rest. The remains of a campfire still smoldered in the center of the space, and Daniel knelt beside it, holding his hand over the ashes. "Recent," he said, "maybe 4 or 5 hours old. We are gaining on them." Tom called a halt and the men dismounted, stretching their legs and checking their weapons. They would need to make camp soon, push on again at first light when they could see the trail clearly. No one wanted to stumble into an ambush in the darkness. Silas stood apart from the others, staring into the forest that had swallowed the outlaws and their captives. Somewhere out there, Thomas and Catherine Monroe were either alive and praying for rescue or already beyond any help this world could offer. The not knowing was the worst part, the terrible uncertainty that gnawed at his mind like a hungry animal. He thought of Sadie and Elijah waiting at his ranch with Ellen, their young hearts full of hope that he would return with good news. He thought of the promise he had made, the weight of responsibility he had accepted when he took those children's hands and led them out of the wilderness. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Tomorrow we find them." The night wrapped around the posse like a cold blanket, and Silas did not sleep at all. Dawn broke cold and gray over the forest, the first light filtering through the trees like reluctant fingers reaching into the darkness. Silas was already on his feet, having spent the night in a state of restless vigilance that left him exhausted but unwilling to waste a single moment of daylight. Around him, the other men stirred from their bedrolls, their faces grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and dried beef, washing it down with bitter coffee brewed over a small fire. No one spoke much, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they might find when they caught up with the outlaws. The possibilities ranged from hopeful to horrific, and dwelling on them served no purpose except to sharpen the anxiety that already hung heavy in the morning air. Daniel Cooper was the first to mount up, his keen eyes already scanning the forest floor for signs of the trail they had followed the day before. Within minutes, he had picked up the tracks again, leading the posse deeper into the wilderness at a pace that tested both men and horses. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed into the foothills. the ground broken by ravines and rocky outcroppings that forced them to dismount and lead their horses on foot in places. Silas felt every one of his 52 years in his aching muscles and protesting joints, but he pushed through the discomfort with a determination born of his promise to those children waiting at his ranch. By mid-morning, they had covered several miles and the trail showed signs of becoming fresher. Daniel pointed out hoof prints that were sharper, less weathered by wind and time, and droppings that were only hours old. They were closing the gap, gaining on men who apparently believed they had escaped without pursuit. Tom called a brief halt at a stream to water the horses and refill canteens. As the men took advantage of the pause to stretch their legs, Silas found himself standing beside Daniel, both of them studying the far bank where the trail continued into a dense stand of pines. "What do you make of them?" Silas asked quietly. "These outlaws, what kind of men are we dealing with?" Daniel was silent for a long moment, his young face troubled. "Desperate men," he said finally, "but also careless. They are not covering their tracks, not varying their route. Either they think no one is following, or they do not care, or they are leading us into a trap." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is possible too. We should be careful as we get closer. Men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous kind." They pushed on through the morning and into the early afternoon, the trail winding through increasingly remote country that showed no signs of human habitation. This was wild land, the kind of territory where a man could disappear forever if he knew how to live off what nature provided. The outlaws clearly knew this country, were using its vastness to their advantage. It was nearly 3 o'clock when Daniel held up his hand, bringing the posse to an abrupt halt. He dismounted and knelt on the ground, examining something that the others could not see from their saddles. When he looked up, his face was pale. "Blood," he said, "fresh blood, and a lot of it." Silas felt his stomach clench as he dismounted and moved to Daniel's side. The young tracker was right. A dark stain spread across the forest floor, soaking into the fallen leaves and pine needles. Too much blood for a minor wound. This was the kind of bleeding that came from serious injury, the kind that could easily prove fatal. They spread out, searching the immediate area for any sign of what had happened. It was Tom who found the body, lying in a shallow depression about 50 yards from the blood trail. He called out, and the others converged on his position with weapons drawn and hearts pounding. But it was not Thomas or Catherine Monroe lying in that makeshift grave of fallen leaves. It was a man Silas had never seen before, rough-featured and dressed in the worn clothing of someone who lived outside the bounds of civilized society. A gunshot wound in his chest told the story of his final moments, and the empty holster at his hip suggested that his weapon had been taken by whoever killed him. "One of the outlaws," Tom said grimly. "Someone shot him and left him here to rot." Silas studied the dead man's face, trying to make sense of this new development. Had the outlaws turned on each other? Had there been a dispute over the spoils of their attack on the Monroe family? Or had something else happened, something they could not yet understand? Daniel was already moving through the surrounding forest, reading the signs that the landscape offered to those who knew how to interpret them. When he returned, his expression was a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. "There was a fight here," he reported. "Multiple people moving fast. I see tracks leading off in 2 directions. 3 horses went that way, heading north. But there are also footprints, 2 sets, heading east toward that ridge." "Footprints," Silas repeated. "Not hoofprints. Someone on foot." Daniel nodded. "Adult-sized, one larger than the other, moving with purpose, not running blindly. And there is blood mixed with the tracks, but not as much as here. Someone wounded but still mobile." Silas felt hope flicker in his chest like a candle flame in a dark room. Could it be the Monroes? Could they somehow have escaped their captors in the confusion of the fight that had claimed one outlaw's life? "We split up," Tom decided. "Half of us follow the riders, half follow the footprints. Signal shots if either group finds something." Silas did not hesitate. "I'm going after the footprints. If that is the Monroes, they need help now." Tom nodded, dividing the posse with quick efficiency. Silas found himself leading a group of 4 men, including Daniel, toward the eastern ridge where the mysterious footprints led. Behind them, Tom and the others spurred their horses north. Silas did not hesitate. "I'm going after the footprints. If that is the Monroes, they need help now." Tom nodded, dividing the posse with quick efficiency. Silas found himself leading a group of 4 men, including Daniel, toward the eastern ridge where the mysterious footprints led. Behind them, Tom and the others spurred their horses north, following the fleeing riders with grim determination. The race was on, and somewhere in this wilderness, answers waited to be found. The footprints led up the ridge through terrain that grew steeper and more treacherous with every step. Silas and his small group dismounted, leading their horses by the reins as they picked their way over loose rocks and through tangles of underbrush that seemed determined to slow their progress. Daniel moved ahead like a ghost, his eyes fixed on the ground as he followed the trail with unerring precision. The blood spots continued at intervals, dark drops against the gray stone and brown earth. Whoever was wounded was still moving, still fighting to stay ahead in fading light. And there, huddled against a massive boulder near the water's edge, Silas saw 2 figures that made his heart leap with desperate hope. A man and a woman, the man sitting with his back against the rock while the woman knelt beside him, tearing strips from her own petticoat to bind a wound on his leg. Even from this distance, Silas could see the exhaustion in their postures, the way they leaned into each other like 2 trees that had grown together and could no longer stand alone. He raised his hand to signal the others, then cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Thomas Monroe, Catherine Monroe, we are friends. We have come to help you." The woman's head snapped up, her body tensing with fear. The man struggled to rise, reaching for something at his side that Silas realized was a pistol. They had fought for their freedom, and they were not about to surrender it easily, not even to men who claimed to be rescuers. "My name is Silas Hartwell," he continued, keeping his voice calm and clear. "I found your children this morning hiding in the forest. Sadie and Elijah are safe at my ranch, waiting for you." The effect of his words was immediate and profound. Catherine Monroe let out a cry that was half sob and half prayer, her hands flying to her face as if she could not believe what she was hearing. Thomas lowered the pistol, his weathered face crumpling with an emotion too powerful to contain. "Our children," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Our babies are alive?" Silas began making his way down the slope, moving slowly with his hands visible so as not to alarm them. "They are alive and safe, scared but unharmed. Your daughter took care of your son through the night. She is a brave girl. You should be proud of her." By the time he reached them, Catherine was weeping openly, her whole body shaking with the release of terror and grief that she had been holding inside since the attack. Thomas sat back against the boulder, the pistol now lying forgotten beside him, tears streaming down his own face. "We thought they were dead," Catherine managed between sobs. "We thought those monsters had killed our babies. Thomas told them to run, and then the outlaws dragged us away, and we never knew if they made it." Silas knelt beside them, taking in the extent of their injuries with a practiced eye. Thomas had a deep gash on his leg that looked like a knife wound, crudely bandaged but still seeping blood. His face bore the marks of a beating, bruises and cuts that spoke of violence endured with stubborn resistance. Catherine seemed physically unharmed, but the haunted look in her eyes told of traumas that left no visible scars. "What happened?" Silas asked gently. "How did you escape?" Thomas took a shuddering breath, visibly struggling to compose himself. "There were 4 of them at first. They took everything we had, beat me when I tried to fight back. They made us ride with them into the mountains. I think they planned to ransom us or maybe sell us to someone worse." He paused, his jaw tightening with remembered rage. "But they started arguing about the split, about what to do with us. One of them wanted to let us go, said we were more trouble than we were worth. The others disagreed. It turned violent." Catherine picked up the story, her voice steadier now but still fragile. "In the confusion, Thomas managed to get a gun from one of them. He shot the man who was trying to kill us. The others scattered, but one of them cut Thomas before he fled. We have been running ever since," Thomas added. "Did not know if they would come back, did not know where we were going. Just knew we had to keep moving, had to survive so we could find our children." Silas felt a wave of admiration for these people wash over him. They had endured unimaginable terror, had fought for their lives against armed outlaws, and through it all their only thought had been for the children they feared were lost. This was the frontier spirit at its finest, the stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. Daniel and the other men had reached them now, bringing water and the medical supplies they had packed for just such an eventuality. As they worked to properly clean and bandage Thomas's wound, Silas stood watch, scanning the valley for any sign of the remaining outlaws. "The sheriff is leading a group after the men who fled," he told the Monroes. "They will not escape justice, not after what they did to you and your children." Thomas reached out and gripped Silas's hand with surprising strength. "You saved our children. You came looking for us when you did not have to. I do not know how to thank you for that." Silas looked down at the man whose family had been torn apart by violence and was now being pieced back together by the simple human decency of strangers helping strangers. There was no need for thanks, not really. This was what neighbors did, what community meant on the frontier. "You would have done the same for me," he said simply. "Now, let us get you home to your children." The journey back to the Hartwell Ranch was slow and arduous, with Thomas Monroe unable to ride on his own due to his wounded leg. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher between two horses, padding it with blankets and securing it with rope so that he could travel without putting weight on the injury. Catherine walked beside him whenever the terrain allowed, her hand never straying far from his, as if physical contact was the only thing keeping her tethered to sanity. Night fell before they had covered half the distance, forcing them to make camp in a sheltered hollow where the wind could not reach them. Daniel built a fire while the other men took turns standing watch, still wary of the outlaws who had fled into the wilderness. No one knew where those 3 remaining men had gone, whether they had scattered to the 4 winds or regrouped somewhere in the darkness, nursing their grudges and planning revenge. Silas sat beside the fire, watching Catherine as she tended to her husband with gentle, practiced hands. The bond between them was evident in every gesture, every whispered word, every look that passed between them. This was a marriage built on something deeper than convenience or social expectation. This was love, tested by hardship and proven stronger for the trial. "Tell me about your children," Catherine said suddenly, looking up at Silas with eyes that reflected the firelight. "The girl, Sadie. You said she took care of her brother through the night." "She did," Silas replied, remembering the fierce protectiveness the girl had shown. "She kept him warm, kept him hidden, kept him safe. When I found them, she put herself between me and Elijah until she was sure I meant no harm. You have raised a remarkable daughter." Catherine's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different from the ones she had shed earlier. These were tears of pride, of gratitude, of a mother's overwhelming love for the child who had proven herself in the crucible of crisis. "She was always the responsible one," Catherine said softly. "Even as a tiny girl, she would watch over her baby brother like a little mother hen. We used to joke that she was born old, that she came into this world already knowing things that most people take a lifetime to learn." Thomas stirred on his makeshift bed, his voice rough with pain but warm with affection. "She gets it from her mother. Catherine was the same way when I met her. Knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how to get it. Did not waste time on foolishness or frivolity." Catherine laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even her. "And yet I married you," she teased gently. "What does that say about my judgment?" The easy affection between them brought an ache to Silas's chest, a bittersweet reminder of the decades he had spent building the same kind of partnership with Ellen. Marriage on the frontier was not for the faint of heart. It required 2 people willing to face hardship together, to carry each other when the weight became too heavy for one alone. "And Elijah," Catherine continued, her expression growing more anxious. "You said he has not spoken since the attack. Is he injured? Is something wrong with him?" Silas chose his words carefully, not wanting to add to her burdens of worry, but unable to lie about the boy's condition. "He is not physically harmed, as far as we can tell, but he witnessed terrible things, things no child should ever see. Sometimes the mind protects itself by shutting down, by going quiet until it feels safe enough to speak again. Catherine nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. She had seen similar reactions before, perhaps, or intuited the truth from her own experience of trauma. The human spirit was resilient, but it had its limits, and small children were especially vulnerable to wounds that left no visible scars. "He will speak again," Thomas said firmly, though whether he was reassuring his wife or himself was unclear. "When he sees us, when he knows we are alive and together, he will find his voice. Our boy is strong. He comes from strong people." The night passed slowly, marked by the crackle of the fire and the distant calls of owls hunting in the darkness. Silas dozed fitfully, his dreams troubled by images of children hiding in hollow trees and outlaws riding through the endless forests. Each time he woke, he found Catherine still awake, still watching over her husband with the vigilance of a guardian angel. Dawn came with a wash of pale pink light that gradually strengthened into the golden glow of morning. They broke camp quickly, eager to cover the remaining distance before the day grew old. Thomas insisted on trying to ride, claiming his leg felt better, but Catherine overruled him with a firmness that brooked no argument. "You will ride in that stretcher until a proper doctor examines your wound," she declared. "I did not drag you through the wilderness just to watch you kill yourself with stubbornness." The look Thomas gave her was equal parts exasperation and adoration. "Yes, dear," he said meekly, and the men around them chuckled at the familiar dynamic of a husband who knew when he was outmatched. They pushed on through the morning, the landscape gradually becoming more familiar to Silas as they approached his territory. He recognized certain trees, certain rock formations, the particular way the land rolled and dipped as it descended toward the valley where his ranch lay waiting. Home was close now, and with it the reunion that would heal wounds far deeper than Thomas's injured leg. It was midday when they crested the final rise and looked down upon the Hartwell Ranch spread out below them. The buildings looked peaceful in the autumn sunshine, smoke rising from the chimney as it had every day for as long as Silas could remember. But today there was something different, something that made his breath catch in his throat. Two small figures stood on the porch, one tall and one short, watching the road with the desperate intensity of those who have nothing left but hope. Sadie and Elijah, waiting for news of parents they feared they might never see again. Catherine made a sound that was half gasp and half cry. "My babies, oh God, my babies." And then she was running, leaving the others behind as she flew down the hillside toward the children who needed her. Sadie saw her mother first. The girl's entire body went rigid, her hand flying to her mouth as if to contain the scream of joy that threatened to escape. For one eternal moment she stood frozen, unable to believe what her eyes were telling her. Then recognition flooded her face like sunrise breaking over the mountains, and she launched herself off the porch with a cry that echoed across the valley. "Mama, Mama!" The two figures collided halfway between the house and the hillside, Catherine falling to her knees and gathering her daughter into an embrace so fierce it seemed she might never let go. They clung to each other, both sobbing, both speaking in broken fragments that made no sense, but conveyed everything that mattered. Alive, safe, together. The words repeated like a prayer, like a spell to ward off the nightmare that had threatened to consume them. Silas slowed his pace as he descended the hill, giving the family their moment of reunion. Behind him, the men carrying Thomas's stretcher moved as quickly as they dared, understanding that a father needed to see his children as desperately as the children needed to see him. Ellen had emerged from the house and stood on the porch with her hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She had spent the night comforting these children, had held them when they cried, and soothed them when nightmares jerked them from sleep. Now she watched the reward for all that care unfold before her eyes, and the joy on her face was almost too beautiful to bear. But it was Elijah who made Silas's breath catch in his throat. The little boy had not moved from his spot on the porch, his enormous eyes fixed on the figures embracing in the yard. His small body trembled visibly, caught between the desire to run and the fear that had locked his voice and movement since that terrible day in the forest. Catherine looked up from her embrace with Sadie, her gaze finding her son standing alone on the porch. She extended one arm toward him, her face radiant with love despite the tears that continued to fall. "Elijah," she called softly, "my sweet boy, come to Mama." Something broke inside the child then, some wall that had been holding back everything he could not express. His face crumpled, his small fists clenching at his sides, and then he was running, his short legs carrying him across the yard with desperate speed. But it was not his mother he ran to first. He veered toward the stretcher where Thomas lay, where his father was struggling to sit up, despite Catherine's earlier admonitions. The boy threw himself at the stretcher with such force that he nearly toppled it, his small arms wrapping around his father's neck as he buried his face against Thomas's chest. And then, for the first time since the attack, Elijah Monroe found his voice. "Papa," he wailed, the word torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Papa, I was so scared. I was so scared, and you were gone, and the bad men were so loud, and I could not find you." Thomas wrapped his arms around his son, pulling him close despite the pain the movement must have caused. His own tears fell freely now, dropping into the boy's tangled hair as he rocked him gently back and forth. "I know," he murmured. "I know, my brave boy, but I am here now. Papa is here, and I am never going to let anyone hurt you again. Never. Do you understand me? Never." Silas had to look away, the intimacy of the moment too raw and too sacred for outside eyes. He walked toward the porch where Ellen waited, and she came into his arms with the ease of 40 years of partnership. They held each other in silence, watching the shattered family begin the long process of putting itself back together. Sadie had joined her father and brother now, the four Monroes tangled together in an embrace that had seemed to defy the physical limitations of human bodies. Catherine knelt on the ground beside the stretcher, one arm around her daughter and one hand stroking her son's back, her face pressed against her husband's shoulder. They formed a single unit, a fortress of family love that the cruelty of outlaws had tried and failed to destroy. "You did this," Ellen said softly against Silas's chest. "You brought them home." "We did this," he corrected gently. "All of us. The posse, the townspeople, everyone who refused to let evil win." Ellen pulled back and looked up at him with eyes that held more love than words could express. 40 years of marriage, and she still had the power to make his heart skip like a young man's. "Those children," she said, "when they first arrived, I did not know if the little one would ever speak again. The fear in his eyes was unlike anything I have ever seen. But look at him now. Look at what the sight of his parents has done." Silas looked, and what he saw filled him with a hope he had not allowed himself to feel during the long hours of searching. Elijah was talking now, the words tumbling out in an endless stream as he told his father everything that had happened since they were separated. His small hands gestured wildly, his face animated with expressions that ranged from terror to triumph as he described hiding in the hollow tree, being found by the kind rancher, staying with the nice lady who made soup and sang songs when the nightmares came. Thomas listened to every word, his eyes never leaving his son's face, occasionally asking questions that encouraged the boy to continue. This was healing happening in real time, the human spirit proving once again that love was stronger than trauma. That connection could repair what violence had torn apart. Catherine caught Silas's eye across the yard and mouthed two words that needed no translation. "Thank you." He nodded in acknowledgement, but the truth was that he felt he should be thanking them. In a world that sometimes seemed determined to prove the worst about human nature, the Monroe family was a reminder of its finest qualities: courage, resilience, love that endured despite impossible circumstances. The sun continued its arc across the autumn sky, bathing the ranch in golden light that seemed to promise better days ahead. There would be challenges still to come, wounds both physical and emotional that would take time to heal. But for now, in this moment, 4 people who had been torn apart by cruelty were together again. And that was enough. That was everything. 6 months had passed since that autumn day when a riderless horse had changed everything. Spring had come to Copper Creek Valley with its usual abundance, painting the hills in shades of green and gold, filling the air with the scent of wildflowers and the songs of birds returning from their winter migrations. The world had renewed itself, as it always did, and the people who lived within it had renewed themselves along with it. Silas stood on his porch in the early morning light, a cup of coffee warming his weathered hands as he watched the activity in the valley below. The Monroe family had not continued their journey to Oregon. Instead, they had purchased a small plot of land adjacent to the Hartwell Ranch, using money that the townspeople of Copper Creek had collected to replace what the outlaws had stolen. Thomas had built their cabin himself, working through the winter months with a determination that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The cabin was finished now, a sturdy structure of pine logs with glass windows that Catherine had insisted upon despite the expense. Smoke rose from its chimney in the cool morning air, and Silas could see small figures moving in the yard. Sadie feeding the chickens they had acquired, Elijah chasing the family dog in circles while his laughter echoed across the distance between the two homesteads. Ellen appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his with the ease of long familiarity. "They are doing well," she observed. "The children especially. You would never know what they had been through, watching them now." Silas nodded slowly, but he knew the truth was more complicated than simple observation could reveal. The Monroe children bore invisible scars that would likely never fully disappear. Sadie still woke sometimes in the night, crying out warnings to a brother who was sleeping safely in the next room. Elijah still went quiet occasionally, retreating into himself when loud noises or unexpected visitors triggered memories of that terrible day. But they were healing. Day by day, moment by moment, they were learning that the world contained kindness as well as cruelty, safety as well as danger. Thomas and Catherine had made sure of that, surrounding their children with love and stability that acted as a balm against the wounds of the past. The outlaws had been caught, all three of them, apprehended by Sheriff Tom and his posse 2 days after the rescue. They had been tried in the territorial court and sentenced to hang for their crimes, justice delivered swiftly and without mercy. Silas had not attended the execution, finding no satisfaction in watching men die, even men who had caused so much suffering. But he had been glad to know that they would never hurt another family, never leave more children orphaned and traumatized in the wilderness. A movement on the road below caught his attention. Thomas Monroe was walking toward the Hartwell Ranch, his gait still slightly uneven from the leg wound that had healed but left its mark. He carried something in his hands, a wooden box of some kind that glinted in the morning sunlight. Silas set down his coffee and walked out to meet his neighbor, his friend, the man whose family had become an extension of his own. They clasped hands in greeting, the wordless communication of men who had shared something profound and life-changing. "I have something for you," Thomas said, extending the wooden box. "Made it myself, from oak that grew on our new land. Seemed fitting somehow." Silas took the box and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet that Catherine had probably contributed, lay a pocket watch. Not an expensive timepiece, but one crafted with obvious skill and care, its face protected by a hinged cover that bore an intricate carving of 2 children holding hands. "Turn it over," Thomas said quietly. Silas did, and found words engraved on the back in Thomas's careful script. For Silas Hartwell, who followed the trail and brought hope home. With eternal gratitude, the Monroe family. His throat tightened with emotion he could not express. This was too much, too generous a gift for simply doing what any decent person would have done. But when he looked up to protest, he saw something in Thomas's eyes that stopped the words before they could form. "You gave us back our children," Thomas said simply. "You gave us back our lives. There is no gift that could ever repay that debt, but I wanted you to have something that would remind you of what you did, of who you are." Silas closed the watch carefully and held it against his chest. "Thank you," he managed. "I will treasure this." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the valley wake up around them. In the distance, Sadie had finished her chores and was helping her mother hang laundry on the line that stretched between 2 posts. Elijah had abandoned his game with the dog and was now attempting to climb a tree at the edge of their property, his small figure ascending with the fearless confidence of childhood renewed. "He talks about you all the time," Thomas said. "Tells everyone who will listen about the rancher who found him and his sister in the forest. The man who promised to bring his parents home and kept that promise. Silas smiled, watching the boy navigate from branch to branch. He is a remarkable child. They both are. They have a remarkable example to follow. Not just Catherine and me, you and Ellen, the people of this town who came together when strangers needed help. That is what they will remember when they grow up. That is what will shape who they become. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the valley and burning away the last traces of mist that clung to the low places. Somewhere a rooster crowed and cattle lowed in the pastures, and the ordinary sounds of frontier life created a symphony of peace and continuity. Silas thought about the day the horse had come back alone, about the fear and uncertainty that had gripped his heart when he saw that empty saddle. He thought about the trail of blood through the forest, the children hiding in the hollow tree, the desperate search that had consumed him until the Monroe family was reunited and whole. He had followed the trail not knowing where it would lead, not knowing if the ending would be tragedy or triumph. But he had followed it anyway, because that was what neighbors did, what community meant, what it meant to be human in a world that sometimes seemed determined to strip away all humanity. And in the end, the trail had led here, to this moment, to this friendship, to two families bound together by circumstances that had nearly destroyed one and forever changed the other. The horse had come back alone, but no one was alone anymore. If this story touched your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling us what you thought. Share this with someone who needs to hear that hope can be found even in the darkest moments. And remember, tomorrow I have something truly special waiting for you. Until then, take care of each other.